based in Senegal, and at the Johannesburg Institute of Advanced Study. And today, we are actually very happy to welcome Professor Iru Wai from the University of Toronto. And my duty is really to introduce him. How are you, Zupa?
I am good, Sabelo.
Great. And I'm going to introduce you briefly before we start, and we are very excited to have you. Professor Zupairu Wai is Associate Professor of Political Science and Global Development Studies at the University of Toronto. And one of his most well-known works is Epistemologies of African Conflict, Violence, Evolutionism, and the War in Sierra Leone, which was published in 2012. An award-winning book, which really changed the way we understood the war in Sierra Leone. And we have common areas with Zupairu, because he works on epistemological questions regarding the nature, conditions, and limits of disciplinary knowledge. And he also works on the intersections of power and the coloniality, and also in the political economy of knowledge. And more importantly, his forthcoming book, Thinking Colonial Library, Mudimbe, Gnosis, and the Predicament of Africanist Knowledge, is of great interest to us here at the University of Beirut, particularly for the Africa Multiple Cluster of Excellence. Zupa is also the president of the International Studies Association Northeastern Region. And today he is going to talk about part of his forthcoming book, particularly on the issue of Thinking the Colonial Library. And even here we had some debates about the Colonial Library. And Zupa is well placed to help us on that, because he has been studying the work of the legendary Viwai Mudimbe, who actually introduced that concept. And Zupa will give you 1 hour to present, and we will have another hour of question and answer, which will be chaired by Professor Farid Esak. And thank you so much, Farid, for standing in. With these few words, I think we can start.
Okay, thank you very much, Sabelo, for those kind words and the introduction. Thank you all for coming. I see some familiar faces. Olivia is here. I saw Vanessa and a number of people, Melissa, and a number of people that I know. So thank you all for coming. I want to start by thanking the institutions that are responsible for this talk. So, of course, the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Studies, the Africa Multi-Cluster Center of Excellence at the University of Beirut, and our one and only CODESPRIA, the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa. And I'm also aware of the fact that meetings of this nature are only really possible because of the behind-the-scene works that go into them. So for all of those people that I do not know personally, who contributed and facilitated my presence here, I want to thank you. What I want to do, as Sabelo said, is to reflect on the concept of the Colonial Library, which is really, this talk is coming from the book that I just completed, but it's not completed because I'm never really happy with what I write. And so I am rewriting sections of it. Hopefully by sometime next year, that book will be with us. And the way in which I want to approach this is I probably will go by way of a circuitous route to actually engage with a text. So I begin by engaging a text that is emergent from actual encounter as a prelude to the concept, of course, that is going to be centered in this talk. And then I will reflect quickly on what the Colonial Library is, and then finally clarify the implications, its implications for Gnostic practices, and also we are now in this moment where everybody is talking about decolonizing something. So what are the implications of the colonial library for the decolonizationist praxis? So let us start in 1564. There is no significance to this date. It's just an arbitrary date, but you will see it is important for the point that I want to make, right? So during the second slaving expedition of John Hawkins is regarded as the pioneer of the English slave trade. Now, the English, they did not really invent anything, but they are always very good at stamping their mark on it, and it becomes their own. And Hawkins came to the slave trade like almost 1 century after the Portuguese had started buying and selling Africans. But Hawkins, through the patronage of Queen Elizabeth and the English royalty, really was able to stamp his mark on the slave trade. And as was customary during this period, European travelers, explorers, slave traders, they always produce an account of the people that they encountered. And Hawkins's slavery activity also produced a similar kind of account. And so that's the account that I want to focus on to open this talk, right? And so the people of the Sierra Leonean coast, Hawkins tells us, are Sapes. They had been conquered and invaded 3 years prior by a ferocious and terrifying invading band of warriors known as the Samboses. Now, unlike the Sapes who are more civil and dislike war, the Samboses are bellicose and cannibalistic. And they ate their captives both as a terror-threatening tactic. I'm sorry, I'm having a feedback, so can somebody turn off their mics? It's kind of distracting. Thanks. Okay, so the Samboses, the Sapes are civil. The Samboses are cannibalistic and bellicose. And what they eat their captives both as a terror-inducing tactic, but also to satisfy their want for meat. And I am going to refer to two passages from the same text, and you will see where this is going. So this is the first passage. It says, the Samboses, I am sorry, I'm still getting the feedback. The Samboses live most by the spoil of their enemies, both in taking their victuals and eating them also. The Sapes do not eat human flesh unless in war they be driven by necessity thereupon, which they have not used, but by the example of the Samboses, but live only with fruits and cattle, whereof they have great store. This plenty is the occasion that the Sapes desire not war, except they thereupon provoked by the invasion of the Samboses, whereas the Samboses, for want of food, are opposed thereupon, and therefore are not only to take them that they kill, but also keep those that they take until such a time that they want meat and they kill them. So in the first place, the Sapes are civil, but then even in the context of war, they also become cannibalistic, but they are not cannibals ordinarily. The Sapes are cannibals because they use that as a military tactic, but also they basically also need to eat meat, so they kill people. Okay, now let's compare this to the next text. But the point here, though, is that this chronicler is actually telling us, and this is just an aside, it is better to be enslaved, because this is an account written by slave traders. So they are saying it is better to be enslaved, at least there is the possibility that you may survive, than to end up in the tummy of the Samboses. But let's leave that, I am digressing. But whilst excoriating the Samboses for their bellicosity and cannibalism, the account also, in the same place, underscores their industry. The Samboses had inhabited here 3 years before our coming hither, and in so short a space have so planted the ground that they had great plenty of meal, so millet, rice, roots, we are talking of cassava and potato, and yam and all of that stuff, pompion, which is pumpkin, pulling, chicken, goats, of small fried dried, every house full of country fruit planted by God providence, as palm trees, fruits like dates, and sundry other in no place in all that country so abundantly, whereby they live more deliciously than others. We have a problem. On the one hand, how can a people who have such abundance, they have meat, they have goats, they have chicken, they have cattle, they have all of this stuff, and they live more abundantly, deliciously than others, also be driven to cannibalism because of want of meat, for lack of food? Now, you might think that these contradictions that I'm highlighting is just a mistake of an innocuous or inattentive chronicler that is just embarking on this quest to describe a people that they knew nothing about. But what I'm actually saying is that, no, these contradictions signify something more profound. It represents a sign of a system of knowledge authorized by what Margaret Hodgin, or Mudimbe after Margaret Hodgin, has told us, encourage the collection of curiosities. Contingent with the violence of discovery, the new political, cultural, economic, and epistemological orders of this period interpreted the world from the perspective of the expanding frontier of the European geopolitical space and the Europocentric virtues and evocations. Made up of conflicting signs, sources, and models, this epistemological order and the text it authorized incorporated a variety of sources and frames. And here I quote Mudimbe, a legacy of knowledge that goes back to the ancient Greeks and Latins, a new understanding about the place of human beings, their similitude and difference in nature, and the issue about philosophical anthropology. And this is important, what is following. In the meantime, what one learns from this confusion seems simply the text as second level, or strictly speaking, second level legenda, a mixture of facts, stories, symbols, presuppositions, and the like arranged according to a contemporary grid. So Michel Foucault, for instance, in The Order of Things, said, and this is what he says about this epistemological system. When one is faced with writing about an animal history, for example, it is useless and impossible to choose between the profession of the naturalist and that of the compiler. One has to collect. This is the order of knowledge the epistemological system requires. One has to collect together into one and the same form of knowledge all that has been seen, all that has been heard, all that has been recounted, either by nature or by men, by the language of the world, by tradition, or by the poets. So during this period, to know actually meant that you had to be in a place where you are able to draw on everything that existed. And so the contradictions emerge from this. Authorizing this order of knowledge that involved reading the world as a book of nature and the prose of the world, this order of knowledge demanded seeing the world as an open book where connections, resemblances, or similarities between all things can be made, so that things are made to gaze upon themselves and reflect their own image back to one another. Central to this epistemological order, in relation at least to cultural difference, was the non-European alterity, was the figure of the savage and the cannibal. And if you were to read during this period, like even Shakespeare, for instance, you read The Tempest or Defoe, Robinson Crusoe, the issue of like Friday as the savage and the cannibal, it's always, I mean, Shakespeare names one of his characters in The Tempest, Caliban, which is a play on cannibal, right? You read Hobbes, like the reports around this period basically focused on this idea of the savage and cannibal, and Europe represented everybody that was not European as either savage, and the savage, of course, has a penchant for cannibalism. Okay, so imagine with the consciousness of Europe, with the first report of the inhabitants of the Americas, the savage came to constitute the cultural and epistemological figure authorized by this order of knowledge and celebrated as the intimate but albeit rejected order of the European thinking subject. As cultural and epistemological figures, and Mudimbe, after Michel de Certeau tells us, the savage and cannibal are multiple. They are found across the length and breadth of the expanding frontiers of the European colonizing space and bear testimony to the new order of knowledge, its Europocentric traces, and the power that made them possible. Indeed, wherever Europe arrived, cannibals and savages were found in abundance, right? And so I want to contrast then this report of Hawkins' trading activities in West Africa, where he's saying basically the Sambosis will capture people and keep them until such a time that they want meat and kill them, with two others that were produced around the same time describing both the Caribbean and Latin America, and bring them, which spoke of those people within the same frame. So here we get Peter Mata, the Nouveau Ordre, the New World in 1501. This is what he said of the people of the Caribbean, and I quote here: "Such children as they take, they gel to make them fat as we do cook chicken and young hog, and ate them when they were well fed. Of such as they ate, they first ate the entrails and the extreme parts and the hands and all of this. The most fleshy parts, they put up for store as we do pestules of pork, of garamond, of bacon. Such young women as they take, they keep for increase as we do hen." So basically, these ones, they will keep people that they capture to eat in West Africa. These ones, they actually will raise kids for the purpose of just eating them. And women as concubines were kept for this purpose, like we do chicken, for raising people that they will eat. Now, John Locke, the so-called father of liberalism, also in an essay concerning human understanding, has this to say of the people of Peru and the Caribbean. And I quote here: "There are places where they eat their own children. The Caribbean are wont to gel their children on purpose to fat and eat them. And Garcilaso de la Vega tells us of a people in Peru which were wont to fat and eat the children they got from their female captives, whom they kept as concubines for that purpose. And when they were past breeding, the mothers themselves were killed too and eaten." So you see, in West Africa, the Sambosis will go capture people, keep them, and then will eat them. Here, the mothers, you raise kids, you jail them, and all of this, right? The accounts of Hawkins' trading slaving activities, like most of those produced by explorers, navigators, slave traders, and travelers in the 16th and 17th century, belong to this order of knowledge. As text constructing and witnessing to an alterity, they barely spoke of the societies they purported to describe. Rather, they attest to the power which made their discourses possible, a power that authorized the invention of the order, the savage, the cannibal, the non-existing tribes present mainly in the account that speak of them. In the context in which it appears, Sapis and Sambosis, as a description of the people of West Africa, seem aberrant, and so are the so-called tribes for which they stand. What they signify is an invented stock, imaginary tribes invented by past and contemporary European imagination. Now, when it comes to Sierra Leonean history, of course, you have a period that is referred to as the Mani invasion. So the Mande Empire was collapsing, and a certain Queen Masariko was exiled, and then she took a band of warriors, and then they went on empire building in other parts of West Africa, right? And so while the series of invasions are said to have changed the political, ethno-linguistic, and cultural landscape of Sierra Leone and outlying areas, it also produced its own curious, right, and fantasies in the figure of the Sambosis and the savage and the cannibal. The texts that record these events and the communities that they describe mixed fantasies with observed ethnologic observation to produce fabulous accounts about societies they hardly knew anything about. I mean, the Mandi were actually Muslim. How can they engage in cannibalism? So let's just bear that in mind, right? So the issue here then is that this idea of producing fabulous accounts and mixing different kinds of accounts. It's actually also witnessed in the account, in the 1561 account of an English traveler, John Locke, not John Locke the philosopher, but John Locke the merchant that went to West Africa and actually met Africans. A Captain John Locke met Africans. He ended up writing about them, saying that he had met people without heads, having their eyes and their mouths in their breast. This is a quote. And a longer version of that quote is in Hammond and Jablo, The Africa That Never Was. Now, the significance about this is that Locke's bizarre account syncretized observed ethnological information with myth from classical antiquity in fidelity to Herodotus Book 4, Diodorus Siculus Book 3, Pliny Book 5, whose questionable facts about Africa had for centuries been widely circulated and accepted in Europe. And now, with this new epistemological order, the recitation of this order of knowledge in the 16th and 17th century legislated and authorized. For you to know, then you have to be able. So Locke is meeting people. Locke is meeting people, but what he's actually doing, he's also bringing the fantasies, because for you to be known as somebody, like to be a Sabelo of that period, you need to draw on everything. So this is what he is doing. But the important thing about this, for the current purpose, is that Locke, the idea of meeting headless people, reduce alterity into corporality. Literally, you reduce alterity into corporality. Africans are physical beings. We don't have heads. We can think. So when Bayat, for instance, this current tendency in African studies to talk about African politics from the corporal valence, people do not really understand what the issue is there. But what Bayat, for instance, when he says politics of the belly, what it does is precisely reduce African politics to that of the corporal valency. And the thing that is really crazy about this is that Achille Mbembe will take that metaphor and run with it. So on the one hand, Bayat says it's politics of the belly. Mbembe reduces, in the post-colony, if you read closely, he reduces politics in Africa to an obsession with orifices, loud mouth, fecal matter, genital organs, etc. So I am not saying that they sit there and try to represent Africans this way, but those discourses that exist somehow have a way of always finding their way into the way in which we talk about African politics. Okay. Now, the problem of these texts, and I will try to conclude this first part. The problem of these texts is that they pose significant problem for African historiography. My first degree is in history from the University of Sierra Leone. And the thing here is that it is really these perverse documents that also constitute some of the source material for writing or reconstructing African history. And here, I want to do something. I'm sorry, I hope he forgives me, but my own professor, who was the person who supervised my BA honors thesis, in his book, A New History of Sierra Leone, writes about Sumba or Sambo's cannibalism as a historical fact. And I quote from his book here. The coastal people live in isolated communities and made no serious effort to unite effectively to challenge the Mani. They were also probably afraid of the Sumba, that's the Samboses. These were fierce fighters and cannibals drafted in the Mani army on their way to Sierra Leone. When the Mani force appeared before a given village, they would send an emissary bearing cloth and arms. To accept was to recognize Mani rule. To reject was not only to risk defeat in battle, but also to be under the further threat of being eaten by the Sumba. As it was, the reputation of the Sumba, enhanced by rumors, was enough to spread terror and a disinclination to resist. In other words, what my professor is saying, and I hope he forgives me, but what my professor is really saying is that the Mani were successful not because of their military tactic. They were successful because of cannibalism and the fear that is generated. But here is the point. When the Mani came against the Soso, who are also a Mande-speaking group with a similar military tradition, they were defeated. So is it a military tactic or is it the cannibalism that is driving? But the thing that is interesting about is that migrating from the text of travelers and explorers and slave traders, these reports so forth have made their way in which we talk about contemporary history. And that idea, especially the past practice of cannibalism in war, has now been reactivated and linked to the conduct during the recent civil wars in Sierra Leone and Liberia. And again, here I return to my professor again. So this is what he's talking about. So during the war in Sierra Leone, there was this hunter militia known as the Kamajo. So people were organizing themselves in groups in order to be able to defend their communities. And local hunters became one of the major formidable groups to defend communities. So this is what my professor, Professor J.D. Ali, is writing about. As Kamajo initiation rites became commonplace in the south and east of the country, subunits emerged with different names and peculiar behavior. There were, for example, the Avondo, the Born Naked, and Yamoto group. The Born Naked group, as their name indicates, went to battle without clothes. The Yamoto were like the Sumba warriors, the Sambosis of Mani armies of old. It was widely believed that the Yamoto ate some of their dead enemies. It is immaterial whether there were practices of cannibalism in the conduct of the Kamajo or the wars in West Africa or anywhere in Africa. What is important, though, is that the epistemological groundings of Africanist knowledge, which relies on this archive that I have described, insist that we look for it. So the way we talk about Africa is always as an exceptional case. So the fantasies, and here we have these fantasies, right, that were authorized by a knowledge system of doubtful pedigree and doubtful veracity, has now been reactivated and has become a normal way in which we narrate our own stories. Indeed, what this witnesses to, consciously or otherwise, is the reproduction of the myth, the fantasies, the fables of the travelogues, the texts and accounts of slave traders. Texts of questionable veracity are made up of conflicting sources and models being passed off as historical truth. They have come to inform the way history is not only accounted for, but also how contemporary political and social processes are narrated and understood. Indeed, the reiteration of the relationship between cannibalism and warfare is so pervasive in popular coverage of African conflict that there is hardly a conflict on the continent where this practice of cannibalism does not raise its ugly head. There is, for example, this idea of a general naked, butt naked in Liberia, right? Whose image brings together violence, cannibalism, infanticide, nudity, all of those registers that index in the imaginative topographies and ideological registers of the colonial archive, African Depravity and Pathology, as archived by the Library of Africanism, exploited, for instance, by the awful Vice documentary called The Cannibal Warlords of Liberia. And this manifests in full, right? Okay. So what this preceding section, this archive that I have described, what it really brings into sharp focus is the epistemological conundrum that is deciphered by Valentin Mudimbi regarding the nature and condition of disciplinary knowledge about Africa. Africanism, that is the body of knowledge on and about Africa, Mudimbi tells us, is constituted by and constitutive of an archive that he has called the Colonial Library. The texts that I just referred to, discussed in the preceding section, the image they create and draw on, and as well as the politics that they make possible and that make them possible are constitutive of this library, the existence of which means that no one comes to Africa innocently. We always come to Africa through recourse of an existing archive whose discursive frames and conceptual gazes implicitly or explicitly, knowingly or otherwise, structure knowledge about the continent. The structuring power of the library, Mudimbi tells us, is that Africanist knowledge, whether produced by Africans or non-Africans alike, Africanist knowledge that fails to be epistemologically vigilant, always runs this risk of reproducing in their own speech. They run the risk of reproducing in their own speech the contemporary, the conceptualities of the colonial library. What exactly is this colonial library that Mudimbe talks about? The concept of the colonial library highlights the way Africa as an idea or a concept has for centuries been invented and continues to be invented within the archives and the imaginative geographies of colonial modernity and its political, ideological, material, epistemic, and existential implications that this has and continue to have for not only the continent, but normally actually people of the global south generally. So you could talk, for instance, of the library of Orientalism, of Latin Americanism. Basically, indigenous people, there is always a library, an archive that exists, those images that we refer to in relation to talking about those people. None of us, even those of us who are born in Africa, I mean, to this day, we refer to ourselves as tribes. Take the Yoruba. The Yoruba, like people, about 64 million people that have their own cosmologies. They have their own rich histories and traditions. And compared to a country like Norway, it's like 4 million. Norway is a nation and the Yoruba are a tribe. And we still refer, what tribe are you? And the first generation of African academics, historians, fought against tribe and native and all of this because it had colonial pejorative connotation, but we still refer to ourselves as tribe. The colonial library, according to Mudimbe, or the way in which I understand it and read it, is not a physical existing library. So it's not like you wake up and you say, oh, I'm going to the library to get a book. Rather, it is an abstraction for the immense body of text and systems of representation that have over centuries collectively invented and continue to invent Africa as a paradigm of difference. This library is the archival content and epistemological configuration that underpin colonial modernity, its technologies of power, its violent, appropriative, material, and social processes, and function as a constitutive undercurrent for the dominant Eurocentric tropes and representations of colonial difference, and specifically African authority. It is thus a manifestation of a colonial will to power and what makes or has made it possible. The colonial library is a modern creation. So the issue here is not to say that you have not had historically the way in which Africa has been represented differently. I was referring to Diodorus Siculus, for instance, Herodotus. Herodotus was the one who made up the rumor. I heard that there are people who have no heads, but I don't believe it. When you get to Diodorus Siculus, then it becomes like there are people who, Herodotus says there are people who, he's heard of people who have no heads. When you get to Pliny, it's like there are people who have no heads. Like, so the rumor starts somewhere and then it goes before you know it, it becomes. But for Mudimbe, it is really in the era of the expansion of Europe from the 15th century that this library was constituted. In developing the general historical frame, Mudimbe develops this division of history in order to historicize properly the frame of the colonial library. And so he refers to first the exotic texts. I have just described what the exotic texts look like. And the second is the Enlightenment classification and hierarchization of difference. And then the third is anthropological search for primitiveness or primitivism in the 19th century. The exotic text, of course, emerged with the expansion of Europe and was defined epistemically by similitude and order of knowledge that collapsed difference and the sameness of the white norm in line with the order of knowledge of the Renaissance and episteme. And when we say similitude, it does not necessarily mean that they were looking for similarities because there was a problem for the monogenesis thesis of human evolution in the Bible was challenged with the so-called discoveries. And so you needed to come up with an explanation that reconciled the two. And to do that, they were looking at Africa and different places in the Americas through the lens of Europe. And so when similitudes or the similarities were not present, then you resort to negative interpretation. And that negative interpretation and the ideas of corruption that was put on those societies was reworked in the 18th century during the Enlightenment, when, according to Mudimbe, savagery was strategically articulated and attached to Africa in a permanent way. In the 19th century, anthropology emerged and inscribed itself on top of all of these species and became the science through which this difference is produced and African depravity is produced. And the point here with Mutimbe is that anthropology then becomes what he calls the epistemological locus of Africa's invention. Not because anthropology was what made up all of the rumors about Africa. The rumors already existed. But anthropology then created the scientific space within which we are able to talk about this in a systematic way, so that African studies, you cannot imagine African studies without anthropology. It is just impossible to, because the emergence of anthropology, but the problem with the emergence of anthropology is also to input certain distortions in the way in which we understand African cultures. And to this day, the debates that we have in African studies, the reason why somebody like Sabelo or the first generation of African historians who are talking about decolonizing the episteme of the way we understood Africa was precisely because of those distortions and the way in which the societies were talking. So Mudimbe, like I said, has located the emergence of Africanism as a scientific field of study and the constitution of the African as an object of study in this last epistemic shift where anthropology emerged. And for this reason, that he has designated anthropology the discipline whose mission it was to invent the order and propose interpretive and explanatory models about their difference as the epistemological locus of Africa's invention. Since its inception, Mudimbe tells us, Africanism has relied on categories and conceptual systems dependent on a Western epistemological order. This conceptual dependence has allowed it to constitute, reproduce, and comment on its own being, as well as to establish Africa as an object of its discourse, while at the same time systematically, and this is a quote, systematically promoting a gnosis that invents the indigenous African systems of thought into the knowledge capitals of the modern disciplines, which remains dependent on an epistemological region of emergence. From this gnosis arose both African discourses of otherness and ideologies of alterity, of which negritude, Black personality, African philosophy, etc., might be considered as the best established in the present-day intellectual history of Africa. So emergent from the attempt, so gnosis then, according to Mutimbe, emerged. So gnosis is just basically this philosophical attempt by Africans to respond to the colonial library. The colonial library constitutes Africa and distorted African cultures in very problematic ways. But the attempt by Africans to respond to the colonial library and say, no, we are not what you said we are, but actually respond and redefine their own being, it's what he's referring to as gnosis. And this gnosis, it says, it will emerge as an attempt by Africans to read, to challenge, to refute, to rewrite, and correct the colonial library and its perverse discourses. But the problem, though, is that this gnosis was also emergent within the very structures of the things that they were trying to move away from. So let's take Things Fall Apart, for example, powerful novel. But Things Fall Apart, Achebe is really looking at Igbo society through the lens of Catholicism or Christianity. So on the one hand, it is a fantastic book. This is why there's always this debate between Gugi and Achebe. I always go to Gugi because there is this debate. But Things Fall Apart, it's a fantastic novel, don't get me wrong. But Things Fall Apart is also looking at Igbo society through a Christian lens. This is why Nwoyi, Okonkwo's son, basically after the death of Ike Mefuna was like, I am done with this culture, ended up becoming Christian. If you go to No Longer at Ease. Okay. So, and despite the fact that the gnosis, and this is the point that I'm really making, is mainly African by virtue of its authors and promotion, and its achievement has been impressive, it remains constrained and dependent on an epistemological order that is complicit in the reproduction of the very discourses it aims to challenge. Put differently, that this Gnostic attempt to challenge the colonial library and refute its claims by recapturing or recuperating and reading indigenous texts and knowledge systems of disciplinary exegesis, have also meant making these texts and systems unthinkable within the framework of their own rationality. The point, so this is a problem of translation. When we try to then go to indigenous systems and cultural systems, or even we take, there is this defeating idea in African studies that for you to be able to produce knowledge about Africa, it has to be based on fieldwork. I have written a number of papers. Later I ended up publishing, but they were rejected because they were like, we want to know the empirical basis of the theoretical claims that you are making. I'm like, bug off. I don't have to tell you anything. Africans are not allowed to be able to speculate about their societies, to theorize their societies. It has to always be about being a native informant. I am not your native informant. I don't want to be a native informant. Now, if somebody says that that's what they want to do, it's fine. But don't tell us that every one of us have to produce knowledge the same way, because that's what the colonial anthropology says. You have to produce knowledge by fieldwork. But fieldwork itself is an external relation to an object. But apart from that, and this is the major problem that Mudimbe is referring to, and this has been my own critique of the decolonizationist period right now, especially in this moment of decoloniality, is how do you translate? What has been the basis of translation? So translation in this sense is not just taking a word and writing it in another language. It is the system of rendering a system, an idiom, from one context into another, and intelligibly translating one context to another. And according to Mudimbe, there is always a fundamental problem that emerged with this process, what he refers to as the chosen text, that is the primordial African discourses, or even the way a life is lived. When you try to bring them into the disciplines already have their own structures, their own frames within which they demand you. For you to be able to produce knowledge in African studies, it has to be intelligible to other people who are located within the field. For you to be a political scientist and international relations scholar, this is why when we engage into the critical projects that we engage on, sometimes those critical projects are manageable and acceptable within the disciplines, because what we are doing is advancing those disciplinary practices. But what we are producing is also actually intelligible within the confines and the rules. You may bend the rules, but the moment you step outside of the rules, then your intervention no longer becomes intelligible. But then when we do that, according to going back to Mudimbe, is that there is always this problem of the issue of the shows the text, the primordial nature of Africanist discourses, which are taken outside of the context of their own rationality and brought into the disciplines. And when we do that, what are we doing? So let's take, for instance, the so-called art, like African art, primitive art. What exactly is this? If you take those objects out of their spiritual or their local or their cosmographical groundings, and you interpret them within the disciplines, and these disciplines are also dependent on Johannes Fabian tells us, and Chakraborty as well, empty homogeneous time. But then in Africa and most places in the world, the temporalities that we exist on are temporalities that are enchanted. But the disciplines require us to produce a language that is disenchanted. So how do you ethically translate two differing temporalities? But also there is this issue that Fabian refers to, what he calls the denial of coevalence, which is basically a temporality problem, where you meet people intersubjectively, But ultimately, it is dependent on you to then translate what you've had in relation to the dialogic exchange during fieldwork into the conceptual categories and epistemic systems of the disciplines. And I think that the decolonizationist praxis is precisely in relation to how do we deal with this question of translation. So the significant point here then about the colonial library and about African Gnostic responses and about the structuring role of anthropology is that there is a paradox. The African has been constituted through ideological systems of colonial intervention archived by the Library of Colonialism of Africanism, but it has also been from within the foundation of these ideological structures and power knowledge system that Africans themselves have sought to interrogate and also escape these colonializing and epistemic gazes. I mean, we refer to ourselves as Anglophone and Francophone. I am from Sierra Leone, somebody is from Liberia. Like, these are entities, all of them bequeathed to us. So the colonial gaze, as well as reproduce our own conception of self and identity, and in order to counter the representation of discourses of sameness and otherness, ideas about culture, society, ideologies of alterity. In other words, there is a co-imbricated relationship between the practice of colonialism and its representational schemas on the one hand, and the ideational and discursive formations as indexed in the archive of the library, which then means that even the knowledge that we produce, sometimes there is a colonial genesis to both disciplinary knowledge about Africa and Gnostic practices. And because of this paradox, the African subject, those who want to talk for the continent, talk about themselves and talk about the continent, are almost always constrained and constantly at risk of reproducing in their own speech, the speech, conceptual registers, and violent signs and symbols of the colonial library. In other words, the ghost of modern colonial gaze and its epistemic and representational schemas are always lurking in the shadows of attempt at thinking Africa otherwise or looking backwards. Valentin Mudimbe himself is a classical example of this. Okay. So the challenge that the colonial library poses for attempts at rethinking Africanist knowledge or decolonizing its knowledge capital and the way decolonizationist quests have been taken up, it's obvious. Drawing attention to the co-imbricated of the colonial ways of existing and knowing with the constitutive registers of colonial modernity, the colonial library cautions against hasty and superficial resolution of the contradictions of colonial modernity and its cultural, identitarian, and epistemic effects. By drawing attention to the difficulty that fraught Gnostic attempts at epistemic decolonization and at thinking the disciplines through the recuperation and recentering of indigenous or local knowledge systems, as well as inscribing the silent voices and erased history of post-colonial existence in the disciplines, they caution against parochial commitments to essentialist vision of politics. If we say, so the question is, if a colonizing period have gone, an imperializing period has gone for 500 years, what exactly in local culture is local? Maybe that's the wrong question to ask. So then for me, and critics, I don't want to go into that, like Achibembe, for instance, says there is a problem with the colonial library in which he says, like Mudimbe, for instance, and not only him, Masolo and others, right? But that Africa then becomes a text. And that text always writes itself into attempt at even refuting it. And Bembe is not satisfied with that. But when he tries to write Africa, you see where it ends. It ends up also with the corporal valencies. So then for me, the very first thing then is that, so what? I think the issue here is not whether the colonial library is good or bad. For me, the issue then is what does it make possible? So the condition of possibility, that is like the most important thing, right? This idea of good and bad, if we are just going to have these dichotomous ways in which then we will never be able to get outside of a cul-de-sac, because anything that you said, there is something good about it and something bad about it. But if we ask questions about condition of possibility, then it allows us to be able strategically to say, this is useful and this is not. So in this case then, if we say, let's return to an authentic African, the authentic Africa does not exist as a pure entity. It's one that actually exists as a palimpsestic, if you want to call it hybrid, not in the way in which Homi Bhabha understands it, because then hybridity for Homi Bhabha basically destroys all forms of hierarchies. And then we exist in this colonial way of being. No. And I'll end on this. Let's take the Ottoman Empire. There is nothing about the Ottoman Empire, apart from the Turkish people who created it, that is indigenous in that sense. The religion is not theirs. It's the Arabs, even though the Arabs will say religion is universal. The land they stole for the Byzantine Empire. The customs that they have in terms of the headgear and all of this, the rituals in court were mixed Islamic, but also from the Byzantine Empire. But can you really say that the Ottoman Empire was not Ottoman? And so when the decolonial scholars say location, and Mutimbe also says where you are located is where you speak at. My own problem with that is sometimes when they say location, as if you are just located and you say, I'm African, then everything else happens. No, location is important, but that location has to be mediated through what you want to call an epistemological vigilance. You constantly have to return to questions. So here, basically, we have to return we don't have to take anything for granted. I can't just say because I'm Mendy or I come from Sierra Leone, therefore whatever I say is authentic. I mean, we have people like George Aiti who are writing something more offensive than what Europeans will write about Africa. So the issue here is now there is the ethical politics that a given discourse aims for is significant. What ethics do you have in the way in which you practice? Because the colonial library is never going to go away. It is there. We are co-imbricated with it. But is there a way in which we could look at, like Mutimbe says, in his own practice, we could look at that and we discard what is useless and we take what is useful. And this comes out, although then there is always the problem, because when you try, like for instance, historical reconstruction, you have to be careful in terms of what you accept or what is not, if you don't want to end up like my supervisor. So, and in all of this, there is also this issue of, so then intellectual métissage or hybridity actually becomes significant in the sense that we have assumed new identities. African cultures are not static. They constantly are being remade. We come in contact with different people. Of course, they are violent and all, and we try to transcend that violence and then remake ourselves, being the new beings that we are with everything that we have. So here, I disagree a little with Gungi. Language is important, obviously, but you can't say it's only when you write in Mende or Gikuyu that makes it African, because the African is not a static being. It's a being that also constantly remakes itself. So authenticity in this case has to be redefined, not a fidelity to a past identity or a fixed identity, but an identity that is grounded in its own being, has an ethical commitment to a certain area, and of course evolves with the condition of the now and the present, bearing in mind all of the historical baggages that come with that. And there is finally the recuperative, what Mutimbe calls reprompt, to reapprehend, to recapture, to resume. So we have to also engage in a particular form of what you say, recuperative politics. But that recuperative politics does not also have to be driven in this binary form that there is an authentic African essence that exists and then you reject everything else. In that recuperative politics, every history we know is told from the perspective of the temporal present. So if we are telling history from the perspective of the temporal present, then every recuperative experience also has to speak to the current condition of the present. And finally, I'll end on the materiality question, which has tended to be ignored in most, not all, but most decolonizationist attempts. Because the thing here is that the materiality aspect of it, like Cabral admonished us, bear in mind that people are not fighting for the ideas in your head. They are fighting to see their lives go forward, to live in peace, to raise their kids in peace and all of this, right? So when we engage in this political aspect of epistemological debates, we should be careful not to reduce it only as a cultural entity, because culture is important. But why is it that, for instance, in the West, where I live, people are open to cultural critique, but they are not open to materialist critique? Why? Why is it that when we talk of sovereignty, it becomes threatening? But when you say I'm African and then you wear your kente cloth and all of that, then you are celebrated. I'm not saying that there is an opposition between the two, but there has to be a way in which epistemology cannot be an end in itself. Cultural and epistemological questions can't be end in itself, but it actually has to be in conversation with the material condition in which we exist. And then the issue here is that, what am I really saying? I am saying that the Colonial Library is there. It's not easy to transcend the Colonial Library, but maybe it is the way in which we are engaging with the library that is the problem. And so maybe we have to redefine the way in which we are located. And I'll end on this line. Fela Kuti, I'm not sure how many of you know Fela Kuti, but Fela Kuti is a fantastic was a fantastic Nigerian political musician who invented Afrobeats and all of it. Right? And the issue with Fela is that he named his music Afrobeat provocatively. But can you really listen to Fela and say his music is African? Yes and no. If you're a jazz lover, you love Fela's music. The only thing is that, like, of course, it's produced in Nigeria, and then you have Yoruba percussion, and the way in which that music is produced, it speaks, even the language you use, it speaks in Pidgin, sometimes in Yoruba, and all of this. But you can't also look at Fela and say he is not African. And that is where, so his location and the politics, the urgency of the now and where he's located, the ethical commitment to an art form, but a politics that also transcended just the art form. It's what defines him. And that is the place that I think that we have to inhabit, just like the example I was giving of the Ottomans. Their empire was Ottoman, it's Turkish, but it is made up of borrowed elements. Africa is not static, our cultures are not static. So the Colonial Library exists. But maybe we should not focus too much on it. Because if we focus too much on it, then we are left in this place of paralysis. There is nothing we could do because the library always comes to haunt us. So I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Is this over to me now? Professor Sabelo? Professor Sabelo, are you there? Yes. Is it over to me now?
Yes.
Okay. Professor Zubairu, thank you very much for a brilliant presentation, but also in some ways, I think, a frustrating presentation. Because the Eurism, the tentativeness, the anger at how the continent and its people were presented, that's all in its place. But then you take us to the example of the Ottomans, which leaves us in a space of what do we then have to not only hold on to, but to move forward with? But you've provided some very interesting questions in all of this, okay? So over to other people in the audience. There are a few questions in the chat already. Yeah, and so I guess, I mean, people are free to request to speak, and then of course, you know, you'll unmute yourself. But I don't know, while we gathering our thoughts, perhaps I should raise 2 or 3 questions from the chat for you to respond to. Now, friends, I mean, I can only call people by the names that I see, okay? So, I mean, it's not disrespectful if I call you on your first name or your family name, it's the name that I see. Right. So the first question starts with a very South Africanism. Only South Africans will understand what this means. It is Handi Olwetu. It is a West African family name, but anyway, starts off with this Aish, you know, Aish Prof. If these journals are rejecting such thoughts as yours, then the idea is there would not be proper to come up with our own platform that would consider ideas that are not a regurgitation of the past problematic ideas. In some ways, the question is raised in a very simplified form, but at a larger distance, the question also asks, what does one do in the creation of, instead of a regurgitation, in the creation of a new quote unquote African library? So that's the first question. Yeah, and then there's another question that also adds to that, and then foregrounds the question of where does quote unquote the funding come in order for that to work. Perhaps you'd like to respond to that first before I move on to the others.
This is the part that I don't like, the part where you get these kinds of questions, right? In terms of, in the book that I just completed, what I said is that critique is always possible. Maybe that's where we dwell. Because the thing is that once we start to move beyond critique, sometimes then we go back to the same place. So maybe we should not be focusing too much on, I mean, it's kind of crazy because I ended up with the instrumental question that it is important for us to focus on the materiality of it all. But now I don't have anything to say in terms of where does this come. The only thing that I will say is that we have to, okay, let me go to the problem of translation in Chakraborty. And that also raised, we could borrow ideas, right? Where he's basically saying, even though translation is a scandal, because there is always this problem of lifting something and bringing it into another, we have to try. We have to try. So the recuperative process of going back to history, just because these histories and the texts that describe them are perverse, does not mean that there is not a way in which we could make choices in relation to what is useful and what is not. And this is the point also. Sheikh Anta Diop's problem was exactly the question that you asked. Because for him, how do you tell a historical sociology or construct a historical sociology of Africa? On the one hand, oral sources go only 100 years. On another, if you are going to rely on carbon-14 dating, you are talking about millions of years or millennia. So then, in between like, how exactly do you reconstruct it? And so that, of all the significance of Sheikh Anta Diop's brilliant contributions, it was really this question, the methodological question of how you inscribe, right? Valentin Mudimbe, who is my own mentor and somebody that I have studied very closely, says we have to invent, because the question of invention does two things for him. On the one hand, invention describes the way in which that I just talked about, how we have been invented in the imaginative library. But on the other hand, invention also invites us to be able to live with the now and rethink the way in which we exist in the present. But that also means history in mind, but not imprisoned by it, right? In all of these cases, if you take or Sheikh Anta Diop or Valentin Mudimbe, there is always the problem of the library coming to haunt you. Like, for instance, in the case of Frantz Fanon, let's come up with a new human. Even though he's told us the humanity, the European humanism and all of this is implicated in the politics of violence and all of this. So I don't know. I guess the point that I'm really trying to say is that I don't know, but we have to try. We have to try to imagine the present. We have to try to recuperate the past, irrespective of the dangers that comes with that. We should be mindful, and the epistemological vigilance that allows us. I mean, the point here is that it is actually in the imaginative geography of the library that says Africans can't fail. Because when we fail, but we have been experimenting with different forms of governance on the continent. There is nothing wrong with that. But if you fail, then nobody wants to understand the politics that went in. Let's take the one-party state. Nobody wants to understand the politics that actually goes into whether it ended up bad or not. There was a thinking that went into this notion of the one-party state. But in Africa, we are not allowed to fail. If you fail, you try an economic work and you fail, you try a political imaginary and you fail, you try something, then it goes back to the depravity of the African who's incapable. But I think we cannot be constrained by that. So in as much as I am critical of attempts at, let's say, decolonizing knowledge and all of this, I also do recognize that I locate myself within that and say, we have to try. I'm not sure I answered your question, but it is a very difficult question to answer because there is no yes and no answer to your question. Right.
You're muted, Professor. Yeah.
Thank you very much. In many ways, I think you've also responded to another question, asking for you to expand on the writing of history from the temporality of the present. Of course, your major emphasis is not on the outcome or the product, it is on process.
That's on the process.
And the employment, I think, of what you called epistemological vigilance in this recuperative process. But there is actually no finality, if I may. There is no finality. There's not a concrete outcome that you are trying to prescribe or to utopianize, if I understood you correctly. Right. Now, let's move on to another question, if it's okay. Yes, here we go. Well, first of all, there's a correction to me that Aish is Aish, you know. It's actually more a very continent-wide thing. But the comment is that the questions we have these days lead us to begin with ish, you know, but we do absolutely have to go to have spaces where we do things our own way. And if our own institutions don't want to put the money where they need, where we need more sites that are willing to support, like Africa is a country, and there are a host of them that we should support, drive, and create more. So that's a useful comment, and one of the comments that gets you, Professor Zubairu, off the hook. How do you kind of concretize, you know, your critique? Then there is just a comment saying, yes, we have to try to imagine what it is to recuperate and to create sites to find the recuperated works. And of course, in many ways, if I may respond, in many ways, it's not a completed, recuperated work that here it is. It is the searcher being a searcher, also creating new works, as you were trying to say, not necessarily based on an idea that field work is a prerequisite for it. Then there's a question from Lando, a question or a comment saying that the work, the invention of Africa, Gnosis, philosophy, and the Order of Knowledge by Valentin Ives is characterized by encompassing a historicist perspective that problematizes the concepts and discourse of what we know of as a mythologized Africa, and the truths conveyed by philosophers, anthropologists, and ideologues, etc., as well as the westernized and or Eurocentric images inherent. Well, it's actually just a quote from Priscilla Weber. There's a thanks for your detailed criticism and a comment that the Colonial Library, when taken positively, helps to reinterpret the present African state and possible interventions. There are no further questions which allow me to raise a question. Sorry? Again? Oh, I was going to say, unless, I mean, there may be other questions coming up, but this allows me to raise a question of my own. Now, in many ways, I mean, Saeed had spoken about this, and of course, he is referred to in a number of other works on the African Colonial Library, and it fits in some ways with what I've said about the Ottoman thing. But I want to know. I mean, I want to know, how is this really different from any of the post-colonial approaches to the question? Because that's really where Edward Said, in some ways, had fit in. When he says that the history of all cultures is the history of cultural borrowings. Cultures are not impermeable, just as Western science borrowed from Arabs, they borrowed from India and Greece before that. Culture is never just a matter of ownership, of borrowing and lending with absolute debtors and creditors, but rather of appropriations, common experiences, and interdependencies of kind among various cultures. Now, Said's thing appears like a bit more of, in some ways, even a bit of a liberal, because we're all equal in our borrowings and in our appropriations. You know, West and global North, global South, the Arab, So, if, for example, you just make a simple statement about, say, the one that you made about the Ottoman process, how in looking at the Ottoman, non-Ottoman, how in looking at it as just a question of borrowing and so on, how does epistemological vigilance come into one's actual dealing, say, with the Ottoman Empire? I'm a bit long-winded when I make a point, but I hope you got it.
Yeah.
Dr. Olivia Rutlazibwa, I recognized you. Yes, carry on, please, Professor White.
Can we take Olivia and Kelly Joe and then and all of this, or do you want me to go first? And because I think yeah.
Whatever you find convenient.
Yeah, let's take those questions.
Okay, fine. Olivia, over to you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Professor Zuba, thank you so much for your talk. It's always a pleasure. I could not have imagined years ago that I would be so grateful to a company like Zoom to make these things possible. Yeah, I think my thoughts are a bit all over the place, but if I had to systematize them, I think I want to make question/comment that is more part of the epistemological aspect of what you were offering. And very simplistic would be, is it possible that to make the colonial turn and the critiques that you have formulated about them meaningful as an antidote to the colonial archives, might it also require of us to quench our desire or to repurpose or reformulate what we do when we do science? And I think that is specifically in relation to producing factual knowledges and truths about certain places. And the reason why I say this is that I think a lot of the contradictions or even the claims about authenticity and all of that, you know, is rightfully raised, they kind of disappear if you take your invitation to turn to the material imperative exercise, and the epistemological aspect of it is a big aspect of it. But let's say if we translated the the materials thing into questions of life and death. I think that's the most straightforward, right? Like if the anti-colonial archive or decolonial turn cannot understand in a particular useful way what happens in the Mediterranean, or any of the many things that we can. But for that, I think a whole lot of the desires that are central, let's say in African studies today, to say like, I know this language and I can describe to you perfectly what this tribe does and that and that. And I think that's a challenge for us as well, not just the white anthropologists that want to discover Africa. And I think that would allow us to recognize a lot of what we see as wrong in the decolonial turn today as just a liberal interpretation and appropriation of something that has nothing to do with decolonial. So to end maybe in that respect, I think it might be useful to think of translation as impossible to start with.
Yes.
But I don't think that's a problem if we don't use translation to produce factual knowledge, truths about a certain thing, but that we use translation as sites of encounter. And then the anti-colonial or the decolonial pushes us to be explicit about why we want to have that encounter. Because the difference between arriving to take over a country and arriving to create a world in which we all live, the difference between a colonial and anti-colonial encounter, right? So I don't think translation needs to be possible. We just have to humble a lot of what we're trying to do. So I don't know if it was a question or a comment, but I was very inspired by everything you said. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our next question, which is the third one for you, is Joe Bluend.
Hi, thank you so much, Chair, and thank you, Prof. Zuba. It's such a pleasure, as always, to hear you speak, and I'm so excited about this book. I guess I wanted to pick up on a couple of points that you made. I mean, starting with the kind of the interrogation of science and the natural and the humanities and that kind of universe of gnosis, of ways of knowing, of epistemology, and kind of come towards your two last points, the one around the recuperative and the other around the material. But I'm thinking of material not as a kind of antithesis to critique, I'm thinking of it more in terms of, I suppose, what Olivia, Dr. Otizigwes just said around the kind of the life and death stakes. And I guess I'm wondering if you see links between the recuperative and the reparative in various grammars, I guess, of that, but I suppose both in terms of material reparations questions and reparations of objects and return and repair, but also something, I guess, that encompasses something beyond of a kind of pure material sense of reparation. And I wonder how this might speak to your reading of the recuperative. And thank you again for this.
Thank you guys so much. I mean, Olivia, I don't have a I agree with everything you just said. So it's like, I'm like, is it a question? It's a comment. I'll take it as a comment and I'll expand on that. But your comment actually goes to Farid's question too, in terms of the issue around the Ottoman, for example, as an example of how we engage in this inventive process, right? And there is something, again, I'll read a section. I am also editing a book on Mudimbe, which is done, and it will be out hopefully the end of this year or early next year. But there is this where I'm using his own words to defend him. And this is what he says when people accuse him of being relying too much on Europeans in the way in which he thinks. This is what he says, and I want to just read this. It comes from On African Fault Lines. So for him, so he's defending Fabian Ebousi Bulaga, the Cameroonian philosopher, late Cameroonian philosopher, against attempts to discredit his work. And Mudimbe basically uses this notion of inscription to describe the complex ways in which ideas are shared and adapted. Now, bear in mind, a derivative abstraction is different from an adaptation. So the point is that we normally like to think that non-Western academics that engage with Western philosophy are derivative. And the point that I am making, and the point that Mudimbe is making in relation to Fabian Ebosi Bulaga, it's like, no, it's not derivative at all, it's adaptive, right? So inscription within these disciplinary traditions, according to Mudimbe, and you could say inscriptions into a way of life, of existing, political, social, cultural systems, or intellectual spaces is defined, among other things, by recitations, by transfers, by rearticulations, by ascriptions and reformulations. And then he goes to the Latin etymology of the word inscriptus and inscribere, which he tells us their semantic value basically boils down to three things: to write down and be written upon, to transfer to the writer, and to ascribe, all of which it tells us are signs that help to create another reality. So the fact that even when we are born into societies, there is always a particular form of transfer and inscription, or we are written on, and we also get to write on that culture, that society. And now this is a long quote where he says, by choosing to accommodate in Latin the Greek ethicals into the Latin morales, Latin thinkers, Cicero and Seneca, among many, process an inscription with its original Greek value. The idea of transfer, the second axis, can be illustrated by referring to the work of Septuaginta in establishing the canon of scripture at the genesis of Christianity. And the idea of ascribing, the third axis, an excellent case will be Aquinas. For their apologetic success, the Summa Contra Gentilis and the Summa Theologica, impressive achievements testify to a double inscription: a faithfulness to Christianity in representing a junction to the Greeks and mainly to Aristotle. Specialists know how to decode this remarkable dependence and also how to name its genealogical conceptual mark and relate them to a particular ancient source. In Aquinas' work, admirable is the adjective for his act of conjugating Greek sources and Arab exegesis under the figure of the philosopher. And I think that's what he's saying. So if relying on Arab exegesis does not invalidate the authority of an Aquinas, why does it have to defy the authority of an Achillembe, Sabelo, or a Mudimbe? Mm. But the thing here, though, is, and it is the point of going back further to the question that you asked, we have to be careful. We can't just say, oh, everybody is borrowing and that's the end of it. No, because like Olivia was saying, we know exactly the kind of borrowing that led to the writing of certain people out of history and out of life. And right? And so if we're saying so you can't just say, oh, it's hybrid, and this is my problem with Homi Bhabha's conception of hybridity, where basically all forms of hierarchy disappears. But the issue here is that if we take, let's say, Mignolo or the Latin American scholars seriously, or even Mudimbe in Parables and Fables, and we say you write from your location and its history and its inscription, then what kind of knowledge do you produce? What kind of politics do you engage in? And in terms of engaging with that place, what kind of ethical politics is being generated? So yes, borrowing is something, but borrowing does not mean therefore that, like, somebody will say, oh well, like, and this is what like Atukwe saying and to some extent Homi Bhabha, oh well, colonial domination was never complete, so now we could go about and do everything that we want to do. But we see the violence in people's lives. So to say that we have to borrow and rethink our current conception does not necessarily mean that we also have to give. And this is why for Mudimbe, we have to also recuperate. A recuperative politics and all of the problems with translation that Olivia was referring to. Maybe, and I agree with you, Olivia, and this is like, I have been dealing with this concept of the colonial library, and recently I just was like, what the heck? Like, who cares? Like, it is there, but can we be mindful epistemically that there are these processes that exist? while at the same time seeking to live with the present and imagine a future, drawing from the past, the things that are usable, because our ancestors or in the past was also not static. So how do we draw on that? And finally, Kelly Jo, your question, I haven't thought seriously about this in terms of reparative, because reparation, the problem with reparation for me is that I also want to be able to hold on to the violence of European modernity and constantly reinscribe that. Reparation is just like in liberal society, once somebody says, I'm sorry, then your crooked is now straight. And I don't want that. So my problem with reparation was like, yeah, we should get paid. And Frantz Fanon said we should get paid. But reparation should not just be, it has to proceed with a politics of remaking the international, the particular kind of wall making, so that it makes it impossible for that kind of violence to be reproduced in a certain way. So it's not just, oh, okay, you are enslaved. Like, for instance, Germany is like, we're giving the Herero people 1.6 billion, and now we don't have to talk about genocide. Like, get out of here. So that is really my problem. My problem is, how do you hold on to and dissolve the violence, whilst at the same time holding those who are responsible for the commission of that violence accountable? But what does reparation do? Is it just giving us money and say, okay, now shut up? Or is it also a politics or a movement, an ethical politics to rethinking the international, to rethinking global history and political relations, so that that kind of violence? And we see some of that, like in South Africa, for instance, right? People are like, oh, now the blacks are in control and they are messing it up. Like, get out of here. Like, we are dealing with histories and structures that are embedded within particular forms of reproduction. Are we recreating politics and society and structures in a way that invalidates the production of that kind of violence? Or are we just using a band-aid in order to be able to pay, to tap at that ahead? And finally, I will end with the question of the epistemological as an antidote. And Olivia, I agree with you, because I think the reason why I say materiality, it's not like, for instance, Sami Amin and others raised questions, but the epistemological question should be coupled with those concerns. There was a reason, for instance, why people like Rodney and Amin and third world Marxism, there is a reason why they were asking the questions that they were asking. You can't just dismiss it. I remember when I was in grad school, somebody was like, my professor, the week for dependencia and world system is like, oh, well, dependencia is dead, so we don't have to do it. And I was like, no. It is on the syllabus. We are going to have it, because the question is, why did Amin or Gonda Frank and Cardoso and others feel that they had to raise the questions the way in which they did? It's precisely because Marxism, the traditional Western Marxism, was incapable of understanding the colonial question. That's basically what it is. And not only that, the way in which it continues also to inform the way in which the world functions. And so when you go back to this, they were like, well, let's really, like, I had a professor in history that told me, oh, how do you, referring to Rodney, don't laugh, this is serious. It's like, how do you underdevelop a society that was never developed? And I was like, this is such a problem. Like, that is because you think that you already know. And in a paper that I've written on state failure, for instance, like, European state formation is always in crisis. And the very thing that they all use, they say the welfare state that they now use as the basis by which they judge everybody else, was put in place after the Second World War. And that was also made possible precisely because you have this possibility of going around the world and displacing your own violence and taking from people. But even then, we live in the societies, that welfare state is now in crisis. You think Trump just came from anywhere? Margaret Thatcher did not happen for no reason. You think the crisis in Labour or in the Conservatives in the UK just comes from nowhere. It's precisely because the state is constantly, permanently being rethought, and people are thinking about different ways. And in all of this, we are still written in that history because our societies are the ones that the violence and the exploitation and everything gets displaced to. So this is the point. We can't just say they're Marxist categories in their form, we just accept them. No, we have to submit them to epistemological critique so that the version that we accept speaks to our current condition and needs and stuff. I guess I don't want to sound like a broken record, but you see where I am going. There is a process that we have to respect and actually be committed to, that we constantly, even the questions that we have answered. Like, for instance, if you read Sabelo's earlier work and where his work is now not the same, there is still something which is the decolonizationist demand that is present in his work. But the way he framed it in the beginning and the way he frames it now, that's the point that I want to make, that we cannot be static. The questions that we've answered, there is nothing wrong with going back to say, I was wrong-headed in framing it this way. Maybe we could rethink this way. Most of the other things that you asked, Farida, they were more comments than questions, and I think I'll stop.
That's fine. That's fine. Just before we move on to the next question, two little things. The one is that there's been a number of expressions of profound gratitude for your presentation and how helpful, firstly for that, and others have expressed how helpful it is more specifically in their own work. So I just want to acknowledge that and pass that on to you. The second thing is I'm slightly jealous of the way some of the other people make these things, like, for example, Sally Matthews, and we'll come to your question on. Sally Matthews says, hi, Zuba and everyone. Oh, so Sally Matthews gets to call him Zuba as if, oh, are they friends or what, She's
my friend, yes.
Yeah, okay, so she gets to call you Zuba, and I have to continue, Professor Y, Professor Zuba.
No, Zuba is fine.
A few days ago, I had a PhD guy from Notre Dame doing an interview with me. And after about 2.5 hours of interviewing, I felt kind of comfortable enough. He was in his late 20s to say that, you can call me Farid. So he was a bit taken aback by that. And he said, oh, can I call you Uncle Farid?
That's Uncle Zuba, that's good. Yeah.
But in some ways also it reflects different cultures, In some cultures, you just can't get away with calling people on their first names. So what I've been doing with some of these things, I kind of try to Google who you are and what's your designation. And so while I insist that everybody calls me Farid, but I guess it's part of being caught up in different cultures. Anyway, Zuba and everyone from Sally Matthews, thanking you for your talk. And then she says, she asked, while we certainly want to increase the spaces to create knowledge in Africa, what I think you and Mudimbe are stressing is that African spaces are also constrained and haunted by the colonial library. What does this mean for the project of creating spaces for knowledge production and dissemination? And then I want to come to another question. It's it's a bit of a longish one. I wonder if Felix Venter, Felix, you're here. I wonder if you want to verbalize your question, man.
Yes, sorry for getting carried away like that. It was such an inspiring and fascinating presentation. I had all these ideas. Basically, I wanted to say that it was very interesting to see how these kind of fairy tales that masquerade as historical accounts begin with these figures like Herodotus, who despite being credited as these pioneering scholars of the Western historical tradition, they also reported these like completely ridiculous stories as facts. And I'm wondering if you think that the inception of the Western historical tradition is being colored by these kind of egregious figures is part of why the historical narratives coming from Europe are so kind of like unashamedly, unabashedly fairy tale, like ridiculous ideas getting passed across as historical record. And if this is a feature of kind of all historical archives, outside of Europe as well, from that region, from that time, or if it is a particular quirk of the Western historical tradition, I'm curious if there are records of what the impressions of empires like Mali had of the strange and smelly Europeans, considering the cultural and economic powerhouses that were so attractive that people braved the long trek from Europe across the Sahara to trade with them. And I'm also curious about characters like you mentioned Shakespeare's Caliban, but I'm curious if, for example, his Othello character, who as a Moorish is certainly a problematic character and full of these damaging stereotypes, but is also recorded as this military consultant who is recognized for his brilliant military doctrine, and is elevated from mercenary to essentially a military governor. And whether characters like him are an extension of the savage archetype, or exceptions, despite again the inherent stereotypes. And just finally, speaking of Shakespeare, I wanted to just say, when people adapt Shakespeare, even in contemporary settings, they don't really try to translate the idiom. They don't even update the language sometimes. And I recently watched a film out of the Côte d'Ivoire called Night of the Kings, and it's a stunning movie. I think it's a real cinematic feat. But what I found really interesting is that it integrates lots of different kinds of like West African storytelling traditions, and it doesn't at all try to translate the idiom for foreign audiences. It doesn't try to explain the function of a griot. It doesn't try to justify the imagery and the dancing and the pageantry and the tradition around everything that is happening. It doesn't at all try and sacrifice its authenticity for accessibility. Instead, the onus is on the foreign viewer to try and make sense of what's happening, as the onus would be of a foreign viewer to try and figure out what's going on in a Shakespearean play. And I'm wondering if this kind of movement to depict African stories without trying to translate at all, and instead put the emphasis on trying to faithfully and powerfully recreate, rather than try and repackage or reframe these kind of storytelling traditions. If this is an option for African stories to be told to move forward, or how can these things also avoid being seen as artifacts and be seen as art? I think this is a problem that you mentioned about how a lot of the kind of conceptual and theoretical stuff that people take as par for the course when thinking about European history and stories is sometimes pushed back against when people try to apply it to African history and stories. And I'm just wondering how that can be kind of challenged.
Okay, Felix, we will forgive you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
We will forgive you for getting carried away on the chat room, okay? Well, we're not going to forgive you any longer if you're get further carried away. Anyway, Zuba,
Yes.
you can respond to, there was one earlier question, of course, I don't know if
Yes,
you right, so you can respond to that. And then Felix had raised at least 4 questions, but I don't expect you to keep track of all of them. So you can respond in broad to the question, unless, of course, you manage to hold on and actually enumerate all the questions or issues that you raised. Over to you.
Good. Sally, thank you very much for being present. I just read your paper again. By the way, the book that I was referring to, a book on Mudimbe, Saleh has a chapter in it in which she is grappling with this question of the colonial library. I'm surprised that she's asking me, because she actually provides a way. 2 papers that she's written recently. One was engaging with there is a book that Martha and I edited in 2018, in which she was trying to grapple with this question of post-development. That the post-development critique is important, but we can't stop there. And so then she is trying to think what happens if you take the post-development critique. So post-development, for those of you who may not be aware, familiar with it, is just basically a radical critique that developed that says, screw development. Development is part of the history of exploitation and violence, and it constitutes in the present particular power relations that continues to reproduce people as underdeveloped and all of this, right? So maybe we need to think of alternative, not alternative to alternative development, but alternative to the very concept of development. And Sally Matthews, when she was a grad student, was like really interested in this concept. It was fascinating. I mean, I was in grad school when post-development, all of us dabbled with it. The very first paper I ever published tried to engage with that post-development stuff. But the issue is that with post-development, there is almost always, you get to this place where, so what then needs to be done? Are we going to leave people to just continue existing in poverty by just saying development is bad? Or is there a way in which we could rethink of? And so what Sally did there was, there are 3 ways in which she was thinking about post-development. One is in relation to Bembe's on the post-colony, where basically maybe we exist within the post-colony with all of its contradictions and make it livable. And another is that you say, you take the critique of post-development and you try to reconstruct something else out of it. And the same issue emerges with the colonial library. If the colonial library is so constraining, then how do you engage with knowledge production? And her chapter is like really fantastic because it also tries to deal with this. The thing, my response to you is to say, to exist, to be alive, is to exist within constraining structures. Whether we like it or not, that's the way. Even within the family, from the day you were born, your parents like, no, don't do this. Can I have cake? No, you can't have cake for breakfast. So no, you can't do this. No, don't punch your brother or sister. No, you can't bite people. No, you can't yell. Use your indoor voice. From the day you were born, you exist within constraining structures because that's what it means to exist in society. But does that mean that we don't function? Does that mean that we don't exist? And I think that's also, probably we could use that metaphor and apply it to the colonial library. And you've done that brilliantly. The idea that existing in a constraining situation does not preclude the possibility of imagining futures even within their own constraints. So, and I try to touch on some of this in terms of using the example of Fela Kuti or the Ottoman Empire. But I think our location and looking at our societies from the perspective of our own needs and our own histories, so that whatever it is that we borrow and it becomes our own. We don't try to leave. Frantz Fanon admonished us, if we want to turn Africa into Europe, then let's leave our fate to the Europeans, because they will know what to do more than the most talented amongst us. However, if our plan is to rethink and reimagine the future, then that's what we have to embark in. And the point that I was making about Africans not being allowed to make mistakes, it's part of also the discourse of colonial modernity. It's just like, recently now I get mad. In the past, in school, I don't ever get mad because there is this image of the angry black man. The discourse of the angry black man defines you. If you are angry, prove, right? You make stereotypes. But even if you are not angry, you are controlling yourself not to be angry. That stereotype is still defining your actions. So maybe it's like going back to Atukwueze, where you started your paper, where you like, Africa should have never been placed in the position where we have to respond to this. Toni Morrison was like, racism or colonial discourses are distraction. Maybe we should start talking about our own societies and just do things. We get it wrong, we get it wrong. Although I am also always aware of the fact that you can't just get it wrong because there are also implications for what you do. So I hope that clarifies, but I will say read your paper and you'll see where I'm going. Now to Felix. Thank you. Like, these are like really fantastic. And I will just start with the last point that you ended up. Olarotimi translated Sophocles' Oedipus Rex into a Yoruba setting. The gods are not to blame. You should read it. One of the most fantastic adaptations I've ever seen. And my introduction to Oedipus Rex was actually through The Gods Are Not to Blame. And The Gods Are Not to Blame, the way he did it, using Yoruba proverbs and parables and using the local landscape and the way, it's the same story. Somebody who, how do you say now, prophesied that he would grow up to kill his dad and end up marrying his mom, and they were like, kill him, throw him away. He went, it was not killed, and then he came and saved the people. And as was customary, now you married the queen and ended up having kids with his own mom. So the same story, but the way in which it is done, it's not the same. If you read Oedipus Rex and The Gods Are Not to. And I think, going back to Olivia's point, translation, even though I say we have to, like she said, and in my own work, I said, translation is an impossibility. That's where you have to start. But it doesn't matter, because what Valentin Mudimbe teaches me is that there could be an ethical commitment to the way, to local text, an ethical fidelity to local text. And you can translate them within the context, even though you are lifting them out of the context of their rationality. Translate them within, with that ethical eye of what exactly they are meant to be. And The Gods Are Not to Blame is an example, not the movies that you are describing where people like, but The Gods Are Not to Blame, or Olarotimi does it so well is the other way, where he's actually taking ancient Greek text, translating it in Yoruba or adapting it to Yoruba, and it is fantastic. Valentin Mudimbe, the last work that he was doing before he got sick is in the House of Libya. It's a chapter which is in the book that is edited by Daniel Oros and Gorinda Thambra and stuff, right? Like Africa Athena. And there, what he is really doing is reading Europe as at the margins of Africa. Fantastic, because he goes to the Biblioteca, in which Libya and Europa and all of this, right? So Asia, Africa, you know, like the mythologies that exist around this, but the way in which he's doing it is basically reading Europe becomes, Europa becomes like a subordinate to that of Libya. And that was the final book I was trying to encourage him. It's like, okay, why don't you develop this into a full volume? But unfortunately, he got sick. So, but the chapter is there, and if you should read that, because then the issue then is that even if you go to the Biblioteca, it's not just to say that the Greeks were representing Africans in a particular way. Actually, in the idea of Africa, there is a chapter, the activation of the Greek text, where he's basically saying that the way in which it has been read is a little problematic, because you could go to the Greek text and you could see the good things, and you could also see some of the problematic representation. So it's not the Greeks that are the problem. And Martin Banner in Black Athena tells us this, right? It's not the Greeks that are the problem. It's when we get to the 18th century and this strategic idea of Africa as the savage original condition of human nature, and it's applied to Africa, then all of those Greek influences, historical processes, got reinterpreted. At least this is Martin. Got reinterpreted, and then savagery was attached. Europe claimed Egypt as Egypt. Well, like a conversation I was having with Siba Grovogi recently was, Africans actually lived adjacent to Greece. They were borrowing from each other. Ethiopia, I mean, like all of this. And yet Europe claimed that the cultural origin of the cultural unity of their civilization is in ancient Greece. Just imagine, what does like Germanic people or the Gauls from France have to do with Greece? Just think of it. It is really a 19th century, 18th, 19th century reinvention of Greece, right? And finally, I'll end on Mali. I know we are running out of time. It's like, Howard French wrote this book recently, which is like a fantastic book, Born in Blackness. And part of the argument that he's making there is that the Portuguese did not come, and I mean, I was taught this in school, so it was actually good to see it in print. The Portuguese did not come to Africa by accident. They were looking for the gold mines of Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa had gone to Cairo, and he brought so much gold, the price of gold in the world market dropped to the point that Mali started appearing on European maps that were developed in the medieval world. And so the Portuguese had witnessed Arab traders because, again, going back to the question of Othello and all of this, the Moors, the Almoravids, and then, of course, Andalusia, where you actually have, let's say, African and Arabic colonies in Spain. The Portuguese had seen the Arab traders and the gold that they brought. And so they started looking. After the conquest of Constantinople, they were looking, normally the history will say they were looking to sea route to India. That was part of it, but not, that was not the only. The Portuguese were actually looking for the gold mines. So the point is that African history is not like this cut-off world where they say sub-Saharan Africa, there was, the Sahara constituted a barrier. In school, we learned about the trans-Saharan trade, in which Timbuktu developed as a center for learning. Ibn Khaldun and all of these guys, if you didn't come to Timbuktu in that medieval period, you are not considered a major academic. So Africa was never isolated, right? But then the history gets told in a very particular way in which then it's because there is a barrier and all of this. The point that I'm making is that we could rewrite history. And the reason why medieval history is easy to reconstruct is because, one, there is the griot tradition in that part of Mande civilization. But two, there is also the development of Arabic scripts, so that some of it, like the local language, was written in Arabic. Why do you think when there was the war in Mali, all of us were like concerned about the library in Timbuktu because we didn't want to be burned? Because those histories exist. And it's the interpretation of those historical material that actually allow us to be able to piece together some of this stuff. So again, the recuperative practices is possible, but it has to be done with epistemic vigilance. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor White. There's one question, I'm afraid, that has been hanging since the beginning, and we have to pay attention, although that'll be the last question. It's from Bert, who is still with us. And I'm not sure if he wants to raise a question himself, but perhaps in the interest of saving time, I should just read it. So, question reads, Kashula has argued that colonial powers have actively worked to prevent the intellectualization of African languages, and they've also deprecated efforts that were there. Would it not be important to devote more attention to such intellectualization and to strengthen the links between wider society and the academic knowledge of production? So let's see how quickly you can answer that question, Professor White.
It's yes and no, because Christian missionaries actually established bureaus for translating religious texts into local languages. So they advanced the written script by using Roman alphabet and stuff. They were able to advance those languages, but it was for religious purposes. That is one. But the second thing also is that the local way of writing was suppressed radically So, and then you had the Roman characters or alphabets imposed in writing. So like in Sierra Leone, the Mende script, they call the Kikako, which was what you wrote with symbols, which is kind of similar to the way in which like you write Ethiopic languages and stuff, was there. But when the Bureau for Translation of Local Bible Studies and Local Languages emerged, the Kikako was pushed to the side, and then we started using Roman alphabet and stuff, right? So on the one hand, so again, and this is the point, that we have to look at conditions of possibility. Even the Japanese, they were never really technically colonized, although they were occupied after World War II. But the Japanese, they have like 3 forms of writing. You got hiragana, you got katakana, and you got kanji. Kanji is Chinese characters. And recently, at least when I was in Japan, they had Romanji. So now you can actually write Japanese using Roman alphabet. I don't think it is a problem because, like, again, like I was saying, cultures are not static. And yes, they ended up, I mean, Gugi himself, when he writes in Gikuyu, he's using Roman alphabets. So there is the condition of possibility. What did it make possible and what did it foreclose is the question, right? And finally, yes, I do believe that we need to cultivate local languages because sometimes the native language that I speak in Sierra Leone is Mende. Sometimes when I listen to people who really know the language speak, it's such a beauty to behold. And it's such, like sometimes I'm like, I try to translate it in English, I can't. Just the beauty of how those languages, and I think we need to cultivate them. Unfortunately, you know, and this is why Nkrumah, and I'll end on this, right? When the debate on how to unify Africa was happening and people were bringing all of these technical problems, it's like, oh, well, what language are we going to use? What? And Nkrumah was like, those are secondary questions. The Chinese, you think Mandarin. Mandarin is a produced language. It's like, okay, we are going to make this the normal. So the Cantonese is Hong Kong mostly. Mandarin, everybody, and that's the language that they build and everybody speak. Are there dialects or, sorry, versions that exist of the same language? Yes, for Mandarin. And so that's why Nkrumah was saying, we don't have to worry. We could take Kiswahili, or we could take Arabic, or we could take Mande languages like Madingo or Hausa. And people could, those are technical questions. But I think it has to be the larger structural and ideational and political question in terms of what is it that we want to happen. So I agree with you, but I think we should not technicalize the question too much. I think it has to be in the larger philosophical.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Time is running out, but very quickly, a comment by somebody. You can, I'm talking to you, Professor Y. You can equally apply this, your appreciation for this, your home language, when it is really spoken by those who are articulate in it, as a beauty to behold. I dare say that you are a beauty to behold. I'm quite serious. No, I'm quite serious. The way, you know, you would feel about that language, your language, this is the way I and a lot of other people who've commented on it, this is the way we feel about you. So just before the last word, Felix has commented, thank you so much, Professor, for all the resources and the answers, and again, the brilliant responses. So, so that is the first word of thanks by way of conclusion. Thank you very, very much to you for being present. I'll come to another bit of advice to you just before I finish. And thanks to everybody here who's been present. And we're also grateful for all the other cooperating partners in all of in this venture of the series of lectures that we have. But Professor, why a bit of advice for you, advice that you were blinded to in the beginning comment that you made, and yet the same advice permeates your whole talk. You told us in the beginning that you're thinking the Colonial Library, your work on Mudimbo, that, wait, no, it's not coming out this year. It's only coming out next year. Of course, your publisher says early next year, but by the way in which you spoke, it could be late next year, or even the year after. Because you said that you're waiting for a perfect draft of every chapter and you keep on rewriting it. But the bloody advice you're giving all of us is there's no perfection. There is only a recuperative process. So I would want to advise you, swallow a bit of your own advice that permeates all of your thinking and get the damn manuscript out of the way and get it to your publishers, okay? Thanks everybody for joining us, and for those of you who've been a part of the series, thank you very much. But I'm afraid, and if you can all put your mute on or unmute yourselves, if you can all unmute yourselves and do this. Thanks. It's been a wonderful evening, a wonderful afternoon and kind of evening in South Africa. And we look forward to having you and all the others together again sometime soon. Take care, people.
Thank you very much, Professor Uncle Farid.
And thanks to Professor Sabelo for the introduction.
Sure. Thank you.
Take care, everybody, and be safe wherever you are, okay? And keep strong.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
So,